that going. You probably all have a little warning that has popped up now. That's part of Zoom's new new security, and we appreciate what they do to make sure we're safe as we engage in meetings online. So as we get started, I invite you to join me in prayer. Let's pray. Gracious and merciful God, we give you thanks for the ways that you meet us and walk with us each and every day, for the ways that you journey alongside us. We give you thanks for the ways that you call us to journey with one another, that we are in ministry together. We're not meant to do this alone, but instead in community as the body of Christ, not simply a finger or a hand. One of the ways we do that is through providing support and encouragement through personnel committees. And Lord, sometimes it's the most difficult work that we can do with one another, and sometimes it's the most holy work. Help us learn how to support and encourage, how to equip and challenge, how to guide, and also come alongside both staff in our congregations and volunteers and our pastors and pastoral leadership. We want more than anything else to be people who shine your light and show your love. And this is one of the ways that we want to be able to do that. So guide our time together, even as you guide us in mission and ministry. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks for joining in on this warm and muggy and still Thursday in July. Charlotte was sharing that there was no breeze down on the boardwalk, which of course is unusual in a beach area. There's no breeze here in Wilmington either. It's just quiet and hot. So we're gonna spend an hour. I'm gonna keep it to an hour talking about personnel committees. And this is one of those topics, one of those areas of our shared ministry that can be so fraught with difficulty, sometimes conflict, misunderstanding. And so I thought diving into this tonight just briefly might be a helpful thing. So I'm going to share my screen. So I did manage to pull a little something together. As always, if you have questions, go ahead and interrupt me. We have a small enough group that I'll intend to move through my slides pretty quickly so that we can have a little conversation, question, answer at the end. So, personnel committees, woohoo! And this is where I want us to start. I want us to start with, first of all, reflecting personally. Think about if you have ever, when was a good experience of you engaging with a personnel committee around your own work? And if you did not have that personal experience, have you been with a friend or a partner or a colleague who has shared a good experience of working with a personnel committee? What kinds of things do you remember feeling or hearing about? What kinds of things do you remember being lifted up as especially helpful or meaningful? Just think about that for a minute. And then I wonder if it might be easier to think about a painful experience. Again, this may not be your own personal painful experience, but if you have a partner or a friend or a child who had a painful experience being reviewed by a personnel committee, what do you remember about that? What do you remember about those emotions, and what was lifted up as hurtful and surprising, or just maybe even mean? Sometimes it's easier for us to remember the hard things. And in fact, I think psychologically it's been proven that negative experiences, negative words, negative interactions stay with us longer than positive ones, right? There's a rule of thumb that for one criticism, you need to have 3 pieces that are celebratory and lifting up and saying, that was great. These 3 things were great, and here's something you could work on. And we as human beings will remember the something we can work on and feel that more deeply. And so thinking as we engage in the work of providing guidance and support for staff and congregations, and for coming alongside our pastors and pastoral leadership, if we can remember our own experiences or the experiences of people we love as they go through personnel committee reviews, that will help us do a better job as we provide support and encouragement in our own settings. And remembering what the difference is. What was the difference between the good experience and the difficult or painful experience? All right, so now that you've had a chance to kind of think about your own story, I'm going to go first to what I call some soft guidelines. Now, we can definitely look at we can definitely look at, you know, the hard guidelines, what the responsibilities are. But before we do that, I want to take a look at the things that are underneath that like I call soft guidelines. So in our soft guidelines, I want to start with us as members of personnel committees, or those of us who are responsible for reviewing staff. And that is part of my position here at the presbytery. I serve in the head of staff capacity, and I have in previous presbyteries and as a pastor, where it has been my responsibility to interact with support staff and give guidance, to correct when things aren't going well, and also to remember, always to remember, to say when things are going well and to celebrate triumphs and a job well done. So it really starts with us. It starts with our own understandings, our own personal biases about the work that's being done. You know, I may have a preference for how a newsletter is supposed to look, how I would do it, right? Do you know, you understand what I'm talking about? That this is the way I would do it. Understanding that that is a preference and not a rule, that it's something I would prefer, but that doesn't make it necessarily the right way or the only way to put together a newsletter. It's not the right way or the only way to communicate. So understanding the difference between my preference and what it looks like to do a job well can be really important. It means that I can go into an interaction with a staff member and not come alongside and say, well, that's not how I would do it, or I wish you would do this differently, but to instead have a conversation. You know, let's talk about what we're trying to, what is our message? What are we trying to communicate? How do we do that the best way possible? And if I am open to learning, if I am open to having my opinion not be the most important opinion, then we can have a great conversation and come out on the other side with a really fantastic newsletter or communication. Sometimes our biases and our preferences are less obvious to us. And so I'll share some personal stories as a new pastor. The first church I served had never had a woman as a pastor. They'd never had a woman in the pulpit on a regular basis. And in fact, there were members of the church who believed that a woman should not be in the pulpit. Some people left the church when I was called as a pastor. Is that something I could change? No. I mean, yes. If I was transgender, then I could have transitioned my gender, but I am not. I identify as a woman, and I was called as a woman to pastor this church. The fact that for some members, that was something that was not acceptable, I couldn't address that. And so to have the session talk with me about that problem felt really horrible. They knew I was a woman when they called me as their pastor. There was nothing I could do to change that. And yet it was being lifted up as a problem. It was because they had a bias. They'd never seen a woman in the pulpit. They had always had a man with a man's stature, a man's voice, a man's way of dressing. That was their vision of what a pastor should be. And I could never be that, no matter how hard I might have tried. And so throughout my 6 years of ministry there were often moments where I was criticized and advised simply on things that were related to my gender. It wasn't helpful. It was not something I could change. I was never inappropriate. And in fact, it was harmful. It was harmful to me. And it harmed our ability to work on other things that could have lifted up our mission and ministry. If I had been wiser, which new pastors usually aren't, I certainly wasn't. If I had been wiser, I might have been able to say, you are asking me to do things based on your preference and not based on my ability to be a minister in this situation. So that's the first soft guideline I'd like to offer, that whenever we are involved in a conversation about performance or in a conversation about job expectations, we start with our own biases. We bring our own preferences to that conversation. And if we're not aware of those, we may be putting things on top of a staff member or a pastor that aren't appropriate. So starting with ourselves is always a good thing to do. And then thinking about the position and what the position is. In the case especially of a pastor. Oh, take a deep breath. It's not the pastor's job to make everyone comfortable. And it's not the pastor's job to help a congregation avoid conflict. In fact, if a congregation always is comfortable and always avoids conflict, then they are not growing. They're not growing in their faith. They're not growing in their mission and ministry. They're not growing as the body of Christ. Our best pastors are the ones who are able to raise that heat enough to make us uncomfortable enough to begin to change. That's where growth happens. Intellectually, we know that our congregations need to continue to change in order to thrive. You know, a new family comes in, that's change. Before anything else happens, that's change. And we need that. We need new families, new members, new ministries, new outreaches to our communities, new ways to love our neighbors. We need that in order to thrive. And at the same time, that is uncomfortable. It just is. And so going to the pastor as part of a personnel review process and bringing complaints of discomfort has to be balanced with understanding that it is the job of the pastor to make us a little uncomfortable. After all, Jesus was not a teddy bear. He made people uncomfortable all the time. So the pastor is called to speak and preach and teach in ways that stretch us and challenge us so that we can be more faithful. And along with that, one of the best things a personnel committee can do is be the group of people who receive those complaints that are based on bias and preference, who receive the complaints on things that the pastor is supposed to be doing, like pushing us beyond our comfort zone. If the personnel committee can receive those things and respond with support. For instance, in my first congregation, the first church I served, if I had had a supportive personnel committee that was able to say, Pastor Cindy is a woman and she's going to wear heels and her voice is her voice, instead of bringing those complaints to me and saying to me, well, we had a complaint about the shoes you wore last Sunday. What? If they had been able to receive that and respond to that, that would have been so incredibly supportive to me. It wasn't my job. They could take that on. So that's one of the ways a personnel committee can help protect and support a pastor by helping to field the things that really are small and that distract from mission and ministry. The last thing I want to say around the soft guidelines is just to raise the awareness that being a pastor in a congregation, doing this kind of work is really distinctly vulnerable. The work of prayerfully considering how God is calling a congregation to live into mission and ministry, to be the body of Christ, that takes some amazing energy. It takes a willingness to listen and a willingness to hear things that then you as pastor are called to interpret to the session and to the congregation. So that is a constant effort of prayerful discernment and consideration. And when we prepare sermons, when we prepare Bible studies, when we prepare for meetings, that is all tied up in that work. It takes emotional energy, it takes a lot of mental energy, and even takes physical energy. Almost every pastor I know has some physical energy that goes into preparing to preach, preparing to lead, preparing to teach. There's also an amazing amount of energy in caring for and coming alongside our congregation members of the presbytery in pastoral care, coming alongside someone who's in crisis and listening and then praying for that person. One of my early realizations as a pastor was that the 1 hour meeting I had with a family in grief or a family in crisis actually took 3 or 4 hours of time in terms of emotional energy, physical energy, spiritual energy, preparing for that meeting, being with that family, then decompressing and processing the conversation, looking for resources or ways to continue to provide pastoral care. So while my calendar might say 1 hour, the reality was an expanded period of time in providing care. That's invisible. It doesn't show up. It doesn't show up on a printed out calendar. It doesn't even show up in a pastor's report of so many pastoral visits, so many phone calls, so many meetings attended. One of the things a personnel committee can do is help be aware of that, both, again, to interpret to people in the congregation who may feel like, I don't see the pastor working. So you can help them understand the time involved in providing care, in doing sermon prep, and preparing for the different parts of mission and ministry. It's invisible. You may never see that, except in what you hear on a Sunday, except in when the pastor is sitting beside your bedside at the hospital or calling you on the phone. So personnel committee can help interpret that to members of the congregation who are concerned. And also to help the pastor say, this takes more energy than what it looks like on a calendar entry. How are you caring for yourself? How are you being refreshed and renewed? How are you making sure that you're not burnt out at the end of the day, so that your call to ministry is one that provides hope and life and love, and not simply a constant outpouring of all of who you are. So those are some of the soft things, the things that it would be hard to quantify in a list of responsibilities of the personnel committee, but go into helping a personnel committee be healthy and function well and be a place of support and encouragement. And so actually I'll say one more thing there really fast before I move on to the more technical stuff. Part of my job as someone who supervises staff is learning how best to be in conversation with that staff. So in a previous position with a previous employee, there was something I needed to address, and it was difficult. It was a hard conversation. I knew that it would be devastating for the staff member in question. And this is previous position that has nothing to do with Newcastle Presbytery. And so knowing enough about the staff person I had to talk to, it was an issue that had to be addressed. I did prep work. Again, that's that invisible work. It was never going to show up on my calendar. I did prep work. I prayed hard about how can I enter into this conversation so that the staff member feels as supported as possible, even while I confront behavior that was inappropriate. So we entered that conversation with a time of checking in. I didn't just enter the conversation by saying, I need to talk to you about what happened XYZ day when you said XYZ thing. No, we started with checking in. How are you doing? How are things going? I knew the staff person's family a little bit. How is your family doing? I knew that the staff person had recently taken a vacation. Tell me about your vacation. We started with creating relationship, building relationship before we moved into the difficult conversation. And it was difficult. It was exceptionally hard. At the end of that difficult conversation, we were able to chart a way to seek reconciliation, to seek amends for what had happened, and to leave that conversation with a time of prayer I believe the staff member felt heard and supported, not scolded, not attacked. And I know that the staff person was able to put into practice what we had agreed upon. Because I put a lot of work into framing what was going to be difficult, we were able to move forward together with a good working relationship with a really difficult situation that had been resolved, and with a better, actually a more collegial relationship, because we had had that difficult conversation together in such a way that the staff member felt supported, even while called to make amends for bad behavior. All right. Whew. I need to take a deep breath, because those things, they take a lot out of us too. They take a lot of us too. And when we do them well, it takes a lot of our energy, mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical. So let's look at the nitty-gritty stuff, the technical stuff. First of all, what does the Book of Order say? So the Book of Order gives the session these responsibilities, and you should be pretty familiar with this chapter, G30201. The session shall have the responsibility for governing the congregation and guiding its witness to the sovereign activity of God in the world, so that the congregation is and becomes, that's that stretching, pushing piece, a community of faith, hope, love, and witness. And then under that, in the Book of Order, it breaks it out into these three specific categories. In light of this charge, the session has responsibility and power to provide that the word of God may be truly preached and heard. And this is what we talked about 2 months ago. Provide that the sacraments might be rightly administered and received. And then third, nurture the covenant community of disciples of Christ. And underneath that, we have the subcategory, this little sentence, employing the administrative staff of the congregation. All right. So the session has that responsibility to employ administrative staff of the congregation. The pastor, of course, if the pastor is installed or a designated position, the congregation calls the pastor. If the pastor is temporary, then the session employs the pastor, but that relationship is always also with the presbytery alongside, okay? So with that in mind, we're going to briefly look at some possible personnel committee responsibilities. So a personnel committee is always responsible to the session. The session can establish a personnel committee or establish a subcommittee, a sub-team. In a small church, which is mostly what I've served, the session has acted as a personnel committee when necessary. So the personnel committee is always serving at the behest of the session. So some possible responsibilities: partner with the pastor and moderator and session to determine staffing needs and appropriate ways to fill those needs with session approval. It could be that a need arises, you realize you need somebody to take care of the physical plant more often, or you need somebody to take care of the outside of the physical plant. Where I was in Massachusetts, that meant hiring snowplows in the winter and making sure those contracts were in place. And then the personnel committee would follow up with the contractor and say, you missed us on Sunday, that's a problem. So that's part of what a personnel committee can have as a responsibility. To review position descriptions prior to filling a position, to say, what do we need? What are the needs of the church? What do we need to engage well in mission and ministry? To make sure that the position description is clear, isn't too vague, because that's where sometimes misunderstandings crop up, where I know what I mean by that, but it didn't say that clearly. So review position descriptions, and then after filling a position, to work with the staff members to help emphasize their strengths and strategize together to address weaknesses. For instance, as we became, again, previous position, previous, not this presbytery, as we began to do more and more online with social media, with email blasts, with a website, we realized that the administrator needed some training. That was new stuff for all of us, but the person in charge of maintaining some of that had never learned how to do it. So part of our job was saying, okay, how can we make sure that you can learn how to do this evolving piece of this position? And how can we support you? So the things that really don't work for you, that you really struggle with, we can find other ways of coming alongside and doing that. In one case, the person wasn't on social media at all. Well, it wouldn't make sense for me to say, well, why aren't you posting to the Presbytery's Facebook page? That wouldn't be fair. No, we found a different way to address that need. Personnel committees can help support the pastor by encouraging and then protecting the regular Sabbath time. I hope you've heard this before, but Sunday is not a Sabbath day for a pastor. Worship is amazing. It's a gift to be in worship, but it's work. It's work for us. And so making sure the pastor has set a regular day every week that's protected, that is Sabbath and rest time. Yes, there are emergencies. Yes, there are crises, and a pastor may have to be willing to let that day be interrupted very, very occasionally. And so as personnel committees, you can help protect that. When someone complains, Cindy takes Sabbath on Mondays. Cindy never answers the phone when I call her on Monday. Can you do something about that? She doesn't respond to my emails on Monday. A personnel committee can say, actually, we support Cindy taking that day as a Sabbath day. If there's an emergency, we know how to reach her. Otherwise, she'll get back to you on Tuesday. That's one of the ways a personnel committee can support and help protect a pastor, so the pastor has that necessary time to rest and be rejuvenated. Encouraging the pastor to take vacation and study leave. You don't need to know what it is. You really don't. But you do have it is a gift when a session or a personnel committee says, hey, it's May, and I don't know that you've got vacation scheduled yet. How are you going to take care of yourself, your family? When are you going to step away for a little time? And then helping protect those boundaries so that when the pastor is away, people aren't expecting phone calls to be returned or emails to be answered. So personnel committee can help both set those expectations and then protect them when the pastor takes Sabbath, vacation, continuing education. And of course, pray for your pastor. I shouldn't have to say that. I'm sure I don't have to say that. But pray for your pastor. Pray for the staff and volunteers of the church. A really important role of a personnel committee is to make sure that boundary awareness training is provided on a regular basis. We do that at the presbytery level for ministers, but it's also important for our church staff to make sure that administrators, church administrators and secretaries are reminded of what healthy boundaries are. to make sure that anyone working with children in the church, whether as a volunteer Sunday school teacher or a youth minister, to make sure that their background checks are up to date, to make sure that their boundary awareness trainings are up to date, and that there's a good, safe church policy that's being followed. Personnel committee can take on that task, and that is an amazing piece of work. And then, of course, personnel committees often propose salary increases based on merit. The hope always is that cost of living adjustments are fairly automatic. I've served churches where there wasn't money to pay the bills, much less a cost of living adjustment. And those churches found other ways. They gave me an extra week of continuing education. They gave me extra Sundays off or extra vacation because they literally could not afford the increase in my salary. But they found other ways to say, we see what you're doing, we appreciate your work. That can be part of what a personnel committee can do. Last page, and then we'll get to some questions and conversation. Just some resources. I sent out two things, the guidelines for session personnel committees from church-wide personnel services of the PCUSA. If you took a look at that, it is outdated. It is. They have not updated it. It has old Book of Order citations. Some of the language is very opinionated. It sounds to me like they were writing in response to some particular situations. Having said that, though, there are some good resources in it. There's some good sample position descriptions and a couple of good templates for, potential questions for review. So it's worth taking a look at while understanding it is out of date and it is opinionated. So grain of salt as you look at that. I also sent out a sample personnel committee description. Pretty boilerplate, pretty standard, something that you could look at, change, throw out, but it gives you an idea of what that might look like. Both of those resources will be posted on the website with the recording and the PDF from this little presentation. And then if you just Google, because this is how I found these things, if you just Google PCUSA Personnel Committee Guidelines, you get all kinds of things. Presbyteries who have their guidelines posted online, congregations who have their guidelines posted on their websites. If you want to do a deep dive and kind of look at a broader swath of how churches and presbyteries are doing this work, it is literally right there at your fingertips. So two resources available, both in that first email and on our website. And then, more than you ever wanted, available through Google. All right. There you go. There is more to say, and there are definitely other things we can cover. But in these last 15 minutes, questions, comments, things you are wondering about. Yeah, Charlotte.
Did you document your discussion with the former employee at your former church when you had the discussion with her about her behavior?
Not that particular one, but in other instances I did. Yeah, that particular one, because of the nature, did not require documentation. But there were times when we wrote out a plan, in a way to address either, whatever the presenting issue was. Yeah, go ahead.
Another question. We had to dismiss in our church a few months ago a young lady that over embellished her skill sets
Yeah.
and basically wanted us to teach her how to do what she claimed she could do. We did do a background check before she was hired. We did write a contract that the minister and she signed. And when another member of the personnel committee and I met with this lady, we felt as a personnel committee, it was very important to not diminish her personally,
Mhm.
that because she had over embellished her credentials. We focused on the fact that the job required, we focused on the job description. The job required you to do this, and several other technical computer related programs. It took about an hour for her to understand that we were not going to teach her, that the job requirements exceeded her own skill sets. And we gave her the 2-week notice compensation. She was separated that day with the 2-week compensation that normally is required. And we changed the password on the computer. While it's difficult to give bad news, I think it's important that people share it in a way that may be helpful to them in the future. And our belief has been it's how you say something to an individual, and especially in a Christian, graceful manner. So that's been my experience when you have to give unpleasant news to someone.
Yeah.
Good news is easy.
It is easy. And in a situation like that, having a clear position description, clear expectations, having a contract with that kind of understanding of separation and timing and, compensation at separation, that those are essential pieces. And again, something a personnel committee can really pay attention to. Yeah. No fun, but important, and important for the life of a congregation. Um, yeah. Other questions, comments, experiences?
Cindy, along those lines, if you've had someone in a position for a while, then there needs to be, maybe along with the review, maybe even yearly, a review of the job description. So over time, what you're really doing and what's written down can get to be divergent. And then eventually somebody goes back and looks and says, we haven't done it that way in, years. So not just when you're filling a position, but, you'd be a lot better off if you have to fill a position if the description has already been, right? Like, what are you actually doing? How much time are you actually spending? Are we compensating you appropriately? All of those kinds of things. So yeah, I'm in the process of reviewing all the job descriptions with my staff. And I think the most recent one is from 2018. Well, things have changed, some more than others, right? Like organist isn't quite as complicated, but sometimes things could be clearer too. I came across one that said 12 to 15 hours a week. Now, what kind of job description is that? Come on, people. Is it 12? What are we paying you for, right?
Yeah,
there should
exactly.
Should be clearer than that. So.
And then the federal requirements in terms of overtime, exempt, non-exempt. churches are still under those umbrellas. Pastors
Now,
are.
my people are all part-time, but you know, what does that mean? So.
Yeah, exactly. The other, and what I thought of while you're talking about reviewing job position descriptions is also to have a conversation where you ask, is this what you expected? You know, to invite the employee or even the pastor, you know, into a conversation. Is this what you expected when you said yes to coming and serving alongside us in this capacity? What has surprised you? What has been hard? What has been joy-filled? And to be able to hear that, especially if there are places where the expectations haven't matched up, that sometimes employees have expectations based on what they thought they heard or understood or their previous experiences. And the personnel committee, the session, the congregation's expectation is different. I think you've all probably experienced the fact that just because I say a word in English and you hear that word in English doesn't mean we both mean the same thing with that word. What's a potluck? What's homecoming? What's, you know, there are all kinds of words that mean different things based on our own context and our own experiences. Yeah, work.
Yeah, I think one of the things to kind of consider as well is that evaluations are emotionally charged and uncomfortable generally for both parties. The person doing the evaluation and the person being evaluated. And so one way to kind of cut the edge off of it is to not make it an annual kind of thing, but to check in more often. And particularly, you know, it's because it's really harmful and not very constructive to wait till the end of the year and zap somebody for something that they did 8 months ago, you know, or and also provides an opportunity to give positive feedback if you're doing it more often. And so that's one of the things that, you know, to maybe consider.
Yeah, and then it's not tied as directly. I mean, for a lot of us, the review is tied to, am I going to get a raise? And so that creates a whole nother level of anxiety and fear because, you know, financial security is something that we all value. And so the only time someone talks to me about how I'm doing in my work is when they're considering how much to pay me for my work. that already, it makes it really emotionally charged. And now it's, you know, it's also livelihood, it's ability to pay bills, it's, you know, sense of security. Yeah, so making those connections more regularly can be helpful in a lot of ways. Yeah. Other questions, comments, wonderings?
Cindy, it's Paul. We had just two things. One, we had to let a person go as well, and just referencing that. But we didn't feel that it was appropriate without at least a probation period, or some documentation to back up any decisions we might make. So so we went through that and then came back together to review if there was any improvement. So we weren't able to, we wouldn't go in and just automatically say, you know, you failed at the expectations and cut someone loose. That was how we handled one. Another thing too with you, I believe that you've said most of your interactions seem to be maybe one-on-one or more personal. where the strength of our church certainly is in committee. And anything that we would do, we certainly would have at least 2 people, if not the full committee, in any type of situation.
Good, awesome. Yeah, part of my experience has been that even if it is a committee, there's one leader, and depending on that person's own self-awareness and own understanding of bias and preference, that one voice ends up dominating. Yeah, so that's, the situation Charlotte raised was a new hire, so relatively short period of time, and it's fairly common now to build in that probation period at the beginning of a new hire situation. Well, we're gonna check this out for 3 months and see if this is gonna work. Where what I think you're describing, Paul, is what happens if you have a longer term employee, someone who's beyond the first few months, beyond, the initial period of employment. And yeah, it's really appropriate to document, as Charlotte had asked, and to seek that probationary period. Say, we need to see these steps of improvement. This is how we are going to support that. So not just to say you have to improve, but we're going to make sure you can take this course. We're going to make sure that you have a little extra time. So instead of just dumping all of the bullets and stuff on you at Thursday at 2 p.m. and expecting you to be done with it Thursday at 5 p.m., we're going to make some changes as well. But yeah, if that probationary period doesn't result in inappropriate gains in performance, to make those hard decisions. Because that's the other thing, which I didn't put in my slideshow, but I'm going to say really fast before we wrap up. We seem to err on 2 sides of this equation in the church. Either we go after things that are not essential, like my haircut. And I've had people talk to me about that. My clothing, talk to me about that. My voice, your voice is too XYZ. We go about the work of supporting and encouraging in ways that feels like an attack, and is an attack, is not appropriate. Or we don't do anything. We err on the side of being loving in such a way that we allow someone to continue in a position where they're not thriving, the mission and ministry is not thriving, but we're unwilling to do the hard work of having a conversation, of setting up a probationary period and steps for improvement, and perhaps making the difficult decision. And both of those things, either erring on the side of focusing on personal stuff or not doing anything, both of those lead to conflict, and they impact a congregation's health. Yeah. And that's an hour. Dang. I am happy to be in further conversation with anyone about this, because it's one of those sticky places for us in the church. How do we support and encourage? How do we do harder things? How do we protect? All those things. Before we close, you are here, so you get to help make this decision. Next month, on the 3rd Thursday, I'm not available to lead this training. I'm actually going to be meeting with the Presbytery of West Virginia to talk about bias and racism and our role in the church. So my question to you, would you like to skip August? That's option 1. Is there another day of the week that you would prefer? And that's option 2. And so the day of the week I would look at would be a Tuesday. So we could skip August, or we could reschedule. I would suggest for August 17th. That's a Tuesday night. And then we could decide on time. So if you'd like to skip August, raise your hand. Okay. And I can't see you, Melissa. So if you're raising your hand, I can't see that. And if you'd like to look at August 17th, raise your hand. All right. I'm happy to do it because either way, it'll be recorded. So 8/17 is your birthday, Rourke. Woohoo! What better way to celebrate? All right. So what time? On the 17th. So I've been picking 5 as kind of a.
Cindy, do you know what the topic will be?
I don't. Do you have a suggestion?
No, I was just curious because, who I get to come depends on what it is. So
Sure. And if you have a suggestion, feel free to shoot that to me in an email. Sometimes it's just based on what I'm hearing. This time of year, it's
right,
often,
what people are asking about.
yeah, it's often time for performance reviews. My performance reviews next week. So I've been thinking about this. Yeah, so if you have an idea for a topic, let me know. Even if we don't do it in August, my plan is to continue offering something each month. So 5 p.m. Is that good? 5 to 6? All right, 5 to 6, August 17th. I'll have a topic and I'll send out that save the date announcement. Thank you all for joining tonight. I appreciate so much the work you do, the mission and ministry you help enable, encourage in your various contexts. And I pray that as you seek to support and encourage pastors and staff and volunteers, that you will be able to see how the Spirit is moving through those conversations. So blessings on your evening. And I look forward to the next time I see you in person or online, either way. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.